A blizzard tears across the Hungarian countryside. The wind screams like something alive. Snow coils around a solitary fortress rising from the hills, its towers black against a starless sky. Winter. 1610. A nobleman rides toward the castle with armed men behind him. His name is Georgi Thurzo. Though his cloak shields him from the cold, it does nothing to protect him from the unease tightening in his chest. The gates of cactus grind open. What spills out is not warmth. It is a stench. Thick. Sour. Unmistakable. Burned wood clings to the air, tangled with a sharp, metallic tang. The kind of smell that speaks of injury. Of blood long exposed. Of suffering left to rot. The men hesitate. Stone corridors stretch ahead, lit by trembling torchlight. Shadows bend and stretch where they should not. Every footstep echoes too loudly, as if the castle itself is counting them. Below the grand halls, far beneath silk tapestries and candlelit tables, lie chambers the servants fear to name. Places whispered about in villages where daughters vanish and prayers go unanswered. The rumors were not exaggerations. A cell door opens. Inside, a girl is chained to the wall. Her body is thin, marked by cruelty. Her eyes stare forward, unblinking. Not with terror, but with absence. Whatever lived behind them has already escaped. Another door. Another girl. Still breathing. Still broken. Then the smell grows worse. A chamber. A table. A body laid out with chilling care. The young woman's flesh is pale, almost luminous in death. Her skin is riddled with tiny wounds. Hundreds of them. Placed with precision. Not the work of frenzy, but of ritual. As if life itself had been drained drop by deliberate drop. Yet the architect of this suffering is nowhere in the dark. She waits above. In the great hall, seated beneath carved beams and ancestral banners, is a woman composed as stone. Her posture is perfect. Her gaze unyielding. Countess Elizabeth Báthory. Royal blood runs through her veins. She belongs to a dynasty feared across Hungary and Transylvania. A lineage infamous for violence, ambition, and dominance. Their reputation rivals that of Vlad the Impaler, whose cruelty would one day be transformed into myth. When faced with the evidence beneath her home, she does not collapse. She does not protest innocence. She does not beg. Her expression hardens. Not with shame, but with rage. Rage at the intrusion. Rage at the audacity of men who dared cross her threshold. This is the true horror. How does brilliance decay into monstrosity? How does privilege become a weapon? How does a woman celebrated for intellect and refinement descend into legends soaked in blood? Stories like these were nearly lost. Buried. Silenced. Forgotten on purpose. If the past still whispers. If some doors must be opened, no matter what waits behind them. We return to the beginning. We follow the trail of the so-called Blood Countess. From old Transylvanian folklore to an isolated stronghold in Hungary. From accusations that shook the nobility to the dark myths that still infect our imagination centuries later. This is not merely a tale of cruelty. It is a reflection of unchecked authority. Of obsession with youth. Of the monster that power can awaken. The beast behind the crown. To understand what she became, we must first examine the world that shaped her. Before the accusations. Before the dungeons. Before the blood. She was a prodigy. A child raised among scholars and sadists alike. A girl imprisoned not by walls, but by expectation and dominance. To unravel the truth, we must travel backward. Into candlelit halls of the 16th century. Into a childhood forged in fear and entitlement. And it begins with a name: Báthory. In that era, it was not simply a family name. It was a warning, and it carried the weight of power. A low mist clings to the land, crawling through forests like something searching for warmth. The Báthory family did not rise through chance. They were ancient. Older than treaties. Older than borders. Older than mercy. They were not merely wealthy. Wealth was common among merchants and bankers who traded coins and favors. The Báthorys possessed something far more enduring. They owned the earth itself. Endless stretches of land rolled beneath their banners. Black forests dense enough to swallow light. Wide rivers cutting through the countryside like open veins. Hundreds of villages scattered across the terrain. Villages where people were born, labored, married, and died beneath a single, unchanging authority. Theirs. Stone fortresses rose from these lands like clenched fists. Castles built not just for defense, but for intimidation. Monuments meant to be seen from miles away. Symbols that whispered the same message to anyone who looked upon them. You are watched. You are owned. For generations, the name Báthory was spoken with a mix of reverence and dread. It was synonymous with triumph on the battlefield and terror in the hearts of enemies. They were rulers of Transylvania, a land both breathtaking and unforgiving. Ancient mountains loomed beneath heavy skies. Forests stretched endlessly, their depths tangled with superstition. Shadows lingered longer there. Legends were not stories. They were warnings. And among those legends was one whispered more quietly than the rest. The people said the Báthorys were not like other nobles. They called them wolf-blooded. Not as an insult, but as an explanation. It meant they were proud beyond reason, relentless, and that something feral lived beneath their refinement. A spark that could not be disciplined, only restrained. The family carried two faces. On one side, brilliance, commanding intellects, fearless generals, natural rulers whose presence bent rooms into silence. On the other, volatility, sudden rages, unsettling silences, a legacy of cruelty that surfaced again and again, as though it were stitched into their blood. This lineage produced champions, and it produced monsters. Elizabeth's own family embodied that contradiction perfectly. Her uncle, Stephen Báthory, stood as the pinnacle of their power. Not merely a noble, not merely a prince. He was King of Poland and Grand Duke of Lithuania. One of the most formidable rulers in Europe. A man courted by diplomats and feared by rivals. His crown reflected glory. His blood reflected legacy. This was the world Elizabeth was born into. She was not simply noble. She was Báthory. Niece to a king. Heir to a name that carried the weight of conquest and command. From the moment she first drew breath, expectation wrapped around her like iron. She would be exceptional. She would be dominant. She would matter. And in that, the world would be correct. But the world did not see the other inheritance. It did not see the instability, the simmering violence, the hunger hidden beneath silk and education. It did not understand the price of carrying wolf blood. In Elizabeth, that darkness would not fade. It would settle. It would grow. Her childhood unfolded behind stone walls and embroidered curtains. A life cushioned by luxury, yet strangely isolated. Tutors replaced playmates. Discipline replaced affection. Power replaced innocence. From her earliest years, it was clear this was no ordinary child. Her mind moved faster than those around her. She absorbed languages with ease. She remembered everything. She watched silently, intently, as though studying the world rather than living inside it. A prodigy. A genius. And something else. something watching from behind her eyes. Because brilliance, in that family, was never the end of the story. Candlelight flickers across stone walls carved with ancestral symbols. The sound of scratching quills echoes faintly, then stops. In an age when many powerful lords could barely sign their own names, Elizabeth was already mastering language. Not learning it. Commanding it. While grown men struggled with ink and parchment, the young girl absorbed words the way fire consumes air. Hungarian. Latin. German. Greek. For languages, spoken with precision and confidence before most children had learned obedience. Her mind was sharp. Unnaturally so. Cold. Focused. Exact. She was raised in staggering luxury. Silk dresses whispered as she moved through candlelit halls. Jewels caught the light and fractured it into glittering shards. Servants stood ready at every hour. Silent. Obedient. Existing only to fulfill her needs. She lived inside a masterpiece. A perfect, gilded image of aristocratic splendor. But paintings do not breathe. And no matter how beautiful they appear, they trap what is placed inside them. Elizabeth's childhood was not filled with laughter or careless play. It was not a time of warmth. It was a regimen. A shaping. A forging. She was never allowed to forget what she was. Not a child. A resource. A living asset of the Báthory name. Her education extended far beyond books. She was trained in authority. How to issue commands without raising her voice. How to stand before powerful men without flinching. How to conceal emotion behind polished indifference. She learned early that feelings were weaknesses to be hidden. Every day she was surrounded by tutors, servants, guards, and courtiers. And yet she was utterly alone. But another distance was growing inside her. Something deeper. Something terrifying. From an early age, Elizabeth's body would betray her without warning. She would collapse. Her limbs would seize violently. Her muscles would lock and thrash. Her eyes would roll back as if searching for something beyond this world. A storm tore through her nervous system, leaving her broken on the floor. In the superstitious air of the 16th century, explanations were quick and cruel. People whispered. They said she was possessed. They said a demon had claimed her. That something dark had found its way into her flawless noble body and made a home there. But perhaps it was not a demon. Perhaps it was something far more tragic. Perhaps her mind, brilliant and overwhelming, burned too fiercely for the fragile body that contained it. A consciousness that felt joy, rage, humiliation, and desire with unbearable intensity. A mind that overloaded itself. And in those moments, it shattered. Each seizure was a fracture in the golden cage. A glimpse behind the mask of the perfect noble daughter. Proof that beneath the silk and discipline, something was deeply wrong. Something unseen. Something waiting. Among the ruling elite, daughters were not raised for happiness. They were raised for leverage. Marriage was not romance. It was strategy. A transaction. A weapon used to fuse bloodlines and solidify power. For a girl of Elizabeth's importance, her fate was decided almost as soon as she could walk. At just 10 years old, while she still wandered cold corridors in oversized gowns, she was promised to another family. The agreement was absolute. The man was Ferenc Nadasdy, heir to one of Hungary's most powerful houses. Their union would bind two dynasties into a single, unbreakable force. Together, their names would influence courts, armies, and borders. At 15, the contract was fulfilled. Elizabeth became a wife. But Ferenc Nadasdy was no gentle nobleman. He was a legend. They called him the Black Knight of Hungary. A man forged not in comfort, but in blood-soaked fields and burning villages. His true home was the battlefield. His purpose singular: to hold back the relentless advance of the Ottoman Empire pressing from the south. He was Hungary's living shield. And he was terrifyingly effective. A brilliant tactician. A relentless commander. Utterly merciless to his enemies. In war, he showed no hesitation. No compassion. No restraint. Cruelty was not a flaw. It was a skill. And this was the man bound to Elizabeth. A woman shaped by silence, control, and inner storms. A man shaped by violence and conquest. Together, they formed something formidable. And something deeply, catastrophically unstable. A battlefield at dawn. Smoke drifts low across churned earth. Bodies lie tangled where they fell. Ravens gather patiently. Ferenc Nadasti showed his enemies no mercy. Every victory he claimed was paid for in blood. But in the brutal arithmetic of the 16th century, this was not a flaw. It was proof of excellence. His savagery was praised. His reputation grew with every village burned. Every enemy broken beneath his command. He was feared. He was honored. He was celebrated as a protector of the realm. This was the man Elizabeth married. A man whose life was defined by violence. A man whose worth was measured in death. A hero. And a stranger. Their wedding was grand. Gold. Music. Banners. Feasts that stretched for days. It was a spectacle of power, not affection. Two great houses bound together before witnesses who understood exactly what it meant. Then, almost immediately, the Black Knight returned to the only place he truly belonged. War. He left behind a young wife in a vast stone fortress filled with echoing rooms and unlit fires. He gave her his name. He gave her wealth beyond measure. He gave her authority few women would ever know. And then he vanished. Not for weeks. Not for months. But for years. While Nadasti fought the advancing armies from the south, his teenage bride became the sole ruler of his domain. Elizabeth did not wait quietly. She governed. She stood at the center of an enormous machine. Lands stretching beyond the horizon. Villages filled with laborers and farmers. Garrisons of soldiers watching borders that never truly slept. She controlled the harvests. She commanded the treasuries. She paid the armies. She decided who ate and who did not. Those who served her learned quickly. Their new mistress was no fragile girl playing at authority. She was precise. Relentless. And she tolerated no failure. Disobedience was corrected swiftly. Mistakes were punished. Discipline was enforced not with pleading, but with certainty. By day, the castle pulsed with life. Officials crowded the halls. Servants rushed between chambers. Soldiers waited for orders that could shape entire regions. She sat at the heart of it all. Composed. Distant. Unyielding. A ruler in every sense of the word. But when night fell, the illusion collapsed. Corridors emptied. Fires dimmed to embers. Voices vanished into darkness. The stone walls that once echoed with obedience returned only silence. Elizabeth wandered those halls alone. Each footstep rang too loudly. Each shadow lingered too long. She ruled thousands, yet had no one to speak to. She possessed unimaginable wealth, yet no companionship. A sovereign trapped inside her own fortress. The only proof her husband still lived arrived on horseback. A messenger. Mud-stained. Exhausted. The letters he carried were never tender. They reeked of smoke and iron. Of blood and damp earth. They spoke of sieges and slaughter. Of enemies crushed. Of fields turned red. Sometimes the parchment itself bore dark stains. Whether from battle or careless hands, no one asked. This was her correspondence. Not affection. Not longing. Only war. And in those endless, empty years, Elizabeth learned lessons that would never leave her. She learned that authority exists to enforce order. She learned that fear is the most efficient tool of control. And she learned that in a cold, silent world, trust is a weakness. The only thing she could depend on was herself. Her will. Her power. And the certainty that obedience could always be extracted. One way or another. A winter wind moves through distant trees, carrying no voices. Only absence. Elizabeth was learning two things at once. How to rule. And how to endure solitude. The territories under her control were immense. Scattered villages divided by forests so dense they swallowed roads whole. Rivers twisted through the land like barriers. Travel was slow. Information even slower. In such isolation, authority was fragile. Elizabeth understood this instinctively. Her husband existed only as a legend now. A name murmured by soldiers. A reputation lingering like smoke. He was rarely seen. Rarely felt. She was different. She was present. She was the face of power her people encountered every day. And she believed, utterly, that their obedience was the thin barrier separating order from collapse. Without fear, everything would unravel. Then came the incident. A servant girl was accused of theft. Something insignificant. Food, perhaps. A small ornament. The kind of mistake born of hunger, desperation, or youth. In another household, it might have ended with a reprimand. But this was not another household. This was Elizabeth's domain. She did not see a starving girl. She saw a fracture. To Elizabeth, the act was not about what had been taken. It was about what it represented. A breach. A challenge. What happens if I disobey? If this went unanswered, others would follow. Disobedience would multiply. Villages would murmur. Servants would talk. They would say the Countess was distracted. That her husband was gone. That the woman left behind lacked the strength to rule alone. And weakness, she believed, was contagious. It spread faster than disease. So she acted. The girl was dragged into the open, forced to stand before the gathered servants. No privacy. No mercy. Elizabeth ordered punishment. Not swift. Not hidden. Deliberate. Visible. The courtyard became a stage. The girl's sobs echoed off stone. Her pleas went unanswered. Guards carried out their orders methodically, while the others were forced to watch. No one was allowed to look away. Elizabeth observed in silence. The message was unmistakable. Pain was the law. I rule here. There is no higher authority. Forget that, and this is the cost. This moment marked a shift. It was not yet the work of someone who harmed for pleasure. It was the action of a ruler who believed terror and respect were the same thing. A woman raised to see cruelty not as excess, but as necessity. She was speaking the language she had inherited. The language of dominance. Of punishment. Of control through suffering. And she was becoming fluent. Worse still, she was beginning to understand how effective it was. How satisfying. Then, in the year 1604, another message arrived. This one did not smell of smoke or iron. There were no battle reports. No victories. Only finality. Ferenc Nadasdy, the Black Knight of Hungary, the undefeated commander, the living symbol of resistance, was dead. Not slain by an enemy blade. Not cut down in glorious combat. But taken quietly by illness in his war camp. The man who had survived countless battles had been undone by something invisible. With his death, the balance vanished. The one man whose power rivaled Elizabeth's was gone. The only presence that might have tempered her authority was gone. Elizabeth Báthory became a widow. She did not retreat into grief. She did not fade into shadows draped in black. She stood alone, unchallenged. And for the first time, there was no one left to stop her. A bell tolls. Slow. Heavy. Final. With her husband's death, everything Elizabeth possessed multiplied. Castles passed into her sole control. Treasuries swelled. Entire regions now answered to a single will. The power of the Nadesty estates fused seamlessly with the already vast influence of her own bloodline. In one quiet moment of inheritance, she became untouchable. No husband. No overseer. No equal. The lonely ruler waiting for letters from a distant war was gone. In her place stood the undisputed master of an isolated world. Sealed off by forests, distance, and fear. For years, Ferenc Nadesty had been a tether. However distant, he bound her to the outside order of men, armies, and political restraint. Now that tether snapped. And a creature long restrained does not emerge gentle. A freed dragon is always hungry. The only question was what it would consume. At first, Elizabeth behaved exactly as expected. She dressed in mourning black. Curtains were drawn. Her household moved softly around her. The loss, though complicated, was real. Nadesty had been more symbol than companion. But symbols matter. He had defined her world. His absence left a hollow space where structure once lived. But grief, for a mind like Elizabeth's, was temporary. The sharp edge dulled. The ache faded. And in the vacuum left behind, something far more dangerous took root. Boredom. For years, her intellect had been fully engaged. Organizing vast territories. Managing supplies. Solving crises that demanded precision and discipline. It had been difficult. Now, it was effortless. Challenges shrank. Decisions became routine. Problems dissolved before they could excite her attention. Her mind, designed for complexity, dominance, and control, was suddenly idle. Like a powerful animal confined to a narrow stall. Restless. Frustrated. Unstable. The people around her offered no relief. They filled the halls. They bowed deeply. They spoke only praise. Advisors nodded in agreement. Servants rushed to fulfill her smallest wish. Every voice echoed the same message. You are correct. You are perfect. You are beyond question. No one argued. No one resisted. No one dared say no. She stood alone at the peak of her domain, isolated by her own supremacy. And so the unused force of her intellect began to collapse inward. Her attention narrowed. She lingered longer before mirrors, studying her reflection in cold silver. Searching. Measuring. Watching for the smallest betrayal. An emerging line. A shift in skin. A sign that time itself was encroaching. In the echoing corridors of her castles, she became fixated on the one enemy she could not command. Aging. Time. Decay. Her brilliant mind, deprived of worthy battles, began constructing a new one. A private inquiry. A forbidden experiment. Not politics. Not war. Something darker. And in the corners of her court, figures waited patiently. People who understood ambition. People who recognized obsession when it bloomed. People who would never contradict her. Only encourage. They offered answers where restraint once existed. They fed curiosity without warning. They shaped obsession into ritual. Because a predator like this is never truly solitary. Even a dark queen requires attendance. As Elizabeth's fixation deepened, she assembled a devoted inner circle. Loyal. Secretive. Willing to follow her into places reason would not go. Together, they would create a new kind of dominion. Not built on land. Not measured in gold. But forged in secrecy. And suffering. Firelight trembles against stone. Shadows stretch, bend, and cling to the corners of the room as if listening. They were never her companions. They were extensions. Living tools shaped by loyalty, fear, and desire. Her hands when she did not wish to touch. Her eyes where she would not look. Her conscience where none remained. The first was Dorothea, called Doro. She was ancient in every way that mattered. Her face was carved with time. Each wrinkle a record of famine, plague, and buried knowledge. She carried no books. No formal learning. What she possessed was older. Superstition. Folk belief. Dangerous wisdom whispered from mother to daughter when the church was far away. When Elizabeth spoke of her reflection with unease, Doro did not offer reassurance. She offered possibility. She spoke softly of remedies never written down. Of powers hidden from men. Of traditions that survived because they were forbidden. She reframed blood not as violence, but as inheritance. As vitality. As a force women had once wielded openly, before fear and shame drove it underground. Life recognizes life. To Elizabeth, it did not sound like madness. It sounded like revelation. Then there was Alona Jo. She had been there from the beginning. Alona had fed Elizabeth when she was helpless. Held her through childhood fevers. Soothed her fears while her mother attended courts and councils. To Alona, the Countess was not a ruler. She was still her child. That love never matured. It hardened. Her devotion was absolute. Unquestioning. Blind. She existed to protect Elizabeth from discomfort. To erase obstacles. To make worries disappear. If herbs were needed, Alona found them. If silence was required, she provided it. If something unspeakable had to be hidden, she buried it without hesitation. Her affection became poison. The kind that nurtures monsters while believing it is kindness. Every court requires enforcement. Elizabeth's came in the form of Janos Ujeri, known simply as Fixco. He was not clever. He did not speculate. He did not reflect. He was strength without thought. A man who understood only command and execution. When Elizabeth spoke, he moved. When she ordered, he acted. He never asked why. He never weighed morality. His loyalty was animal. His silence absolute. Finally, there was Judith Thurzo. A woman of order. She managed one of Elizabeth's distant estates. Unlike the others, she dealt not in dreams or devotion, but logistics. She knew the countryside intimately. She knew which villages were starving, which families were desperate, which daughters were expendable. She understood that disappearance required planning, and she planned well. Together, they formed a grim symmetry. The mystic. The mother. The brute. The administrator. They gathered around their isolated ruler. Bound not by affection, but by secrecy. And by the understanding that once crossed, there was no return. The mechanism was complete. The curtain lifted. The first act was ready. Elizabeth Báthory had bent everything in her world to her will. Land. Labor. Loyalty. Fear. Everything. Except one thing. Her mirror. Late at night, when the castle slept and even the guard's footsteps faded into stone, Elizabeth retreated to her private chamber. There, illuminated by a single flame, stood a large mirror of polished silver. For decades it had been faithful. It reflected dominance. intelligence. Youth held rigid by discipline and pride. It showed her the face of a Báthory. Untouched. Commanding. Eternal. But now, the mirror had changed. Or perhaps she had. It revealed a faint line near her eye. Shallow, but undeniable. A softness beneath the jaw where skin no longer snapped tight with motion. Shadows where light once rested easily. Small things. Insignificant things. Yet to Elizabeth, they were treason. The mirror did not flatter. It told her the truth she could not punish. Time was advancing. And it was winning. She stared at her reflection for hours. Unmoving. Studying it the way a general studies an enemy map. Calculating. Planning. Because Elizabeth did not accept defeat. Not from armies. Not from men. And certainly not from age. And somewhere in the darkness behind her, the answer was already waiting. A single candle burns low, its flame trembling. What Elizabeth saw in the mirror were small changes. Insignificant by ordinary measure. The kind of things most women would accept as the slow, honest work of time. But Elizabeth was not most women. To her, these marks were not natural. They were an assault. In her world, beauty was not vanity. It was authority. A visible proof of vitality, dominance, and superior blood. Youth was power made flesh. And power, above all else, had to be controlled. She controlled servants. She controlled wealth. She controlled land, castles, lives. But time obeyed no command. Aging felt like theft. Like something invading her body without permission. It was rebellion beneath her skin, and she could not punish it. For the first time in her life, Elizabeth faced a battle she sensed she might lose. This was not about beauty. This was about mortality. Each glance into the mirror reminded her she was not eternal. That her authority had limits. That her body, like everything else, could decay. The reflection became her tyrant. It watched her. Judged her. Whispered truths she could not silence. And as she stared into her own eyes, she saw something else reflected back. The fine lines mirrored fractures already forming within her. Years of isolation. Boredom calcified into cruelty. Power practiced without restraint. The rot inside was beginning to surface. Elizabeth Báthory made a decision. She would not surrender. She would fight time itself. And she would pay any price to win. The war began quietly. Not with rituals or screams. But in the stillness of her private chamber. And like all wars, it required a weapon. She found it by accident. One afternoon, Elizabeth sat before her mirror while a young servant combed her long dark hair. The girl's hands trembled. Nervous. Tired. Afraid of making a mistake. She did. The comb snagged. The pull was sharp. Pain flashed across Elizabeth's scalp. Something inside her snapped. All the boredom. All the frustration. All the unspoken rage at her own fading youth. It erupted. She did not speak. She turned. And struck. The blow was violent, fueled by everything she had buried for years. The girl staggered backward, a cry tearing from her throat. Blood sprayed from her split lip, scattering through the air. A few crimson droplets landed on the back of Elizabeth's hand. Silence fell. Elizabeth stared at the blood staining her pale skin. Annoyed, she reached for a silk cloth and began to wipe it away. Then she stopped. Her fingers froze. Her gaze locked onto the place where the blood had touched. The skin beneath looked different. Smoother. Brighter. Alive. The faint lines she had obsessed over seemed diminished. Perhaps gone. Was it real? Or was her mind so desperate it manufactured hope where none existed? It did not matter. In that instant, an idea took root. A connection formed. Terrible. Seductive. Irreversible. Youth and blood. Preservation and pain. She looked at her own hand. Then at the servant girl. Bleeding. Trembling. Terrified. And for the first time, Elizabeth did not see a mistake. She saw potential. She saw a resource. A harvest. The Countess stood motionless. Her heart raced. Her mind accelerated faster than reason could follow. She was not alone. From the shadows, Dorothea watched. Doro had served the family long enough to recognize the moment when pride curdled into obsession. She understood the fear of aging. She saw the spark in Elizabeth's eyes. Not guilt. Not shock. Revelation. The old woman stepped closer, her movements careful and deliberate. She leaned toward Elizabeth. And in a voice barely above silence, the war against time received its first instruction. Firelight flickers across Dorothea's face, catching in her eyes. Blood, my lady? The oldest magic. Her voice was low and reverent, as if reciting a prayer long forbidden. The blood of a healthy young girl carries life. It is renewal. Like morning dew upon the skin. It makes what is fading new again. The words settled into Elizabeth's mind and locked into place. What had been a violent impulse became structure. What had been rage became intention. The madness found direction. This would not be chaos. It would be method. It would be ritual. And so it began. Not with rivers of blood. Not with legend or spectacle. But with quiet, incremental cruelty. A dropped plate. A delayed response. A mistake small enough to justify punishment. That was all that was needed. The girl would be removed discreetly, led away from watchful eyes into a private chamber. Ilona, the ever-gentle nurse, would be there first. Her voice soothing. Her touch maternal. Do not be afraid. This will be over soon. Then Fixco would step forward. Silent. Immovable. Strong hands restrained struggling limbs while the punishment unfolded. But now the blows were no longer the purpose. The blood was. A small cut. A shallow wound. Just enough. The crimson liquid was caught carefully in a silver bowl, gleaming in the firelight like something sacred. Later, alone in her chamber, Elizabeth performed her ritual. She dipped her fingers into the warm blood and smoothed it across her face. Her hands. Her throat. She stared into her mirror, searching desperately for proof. Believing. Needing to believe. Her attendants offered encouragement. You look radiant tonight. Younger. Restored. Elizabeth accepted it as truth. It was a perfect closed loop of delusion and affirmation. A system sealed tight by secrecy, loyalty, and fear. For a time, this was enough. The horror remained contained within stone walls. The victims were servants. Girls already trapped. Their cries smothered by thick masonry and obedience. A grotesque parody of beauty, enacted nightly by firelight. But the mirror was never satisfied. Its judgment never softened. Elizabeth's fear did not diminish. It sharpened. Small amounts were no longer enough. The ritual demanded more. The dragon stirred. Its hunger grew. Soon, the supply within the castle thinned. Faces grew wary. Servants disappeared. Whispers began to stir. Elizabeth's obsession had outgrown her walls. She needed abundance. She needed youth untouched by her darkness. Her gaze shifted outward. Down the winding road from the hilltop fortress to the villages nestled below. Places filled with healthy young girls who still laughed. Who still lived in sunlight. The need could no longer be hidden. The hunt was about to begin. Until now, this story has belonged to Elizabeth. To her mind. Her fear. Her descent. But horror is never only about the monster. It is about those who never chose to be near it. So now we leave the castle. We descend into the valley. We meet the innocent. This part is difficult. But for those who are silenced, it must be told. We meet a girl named Ilona. She did not live among silk and silver. Her world was wood and mud and exhaustion. She lived with her family in a small hut. Dirt floor beneath her feet. Straw roof above her head. Her days began at dawn and ended only when her body gave out. She helped her mother in the garden. She hauled water from the well. She watched her younger brother play in the dust. Her hands were rough. Her back ached. She had never seen a mirror of silver. And she had no idea that high above her village, something ancient and hungry had already noticed her. Morning light spills across a poor village, soft and fragile as breath in cold air. Ella's clothes were worn thin, patched again and again by careful hands. They were not velvet. They did not shimmer in candlelight. They smelled of smoke, soil, and honest labor. Her life was small. But it was hers. She did not dream of thrones or titles. Her hopes were modest, fragile, and achingly human. A pair of winter shoes without holes. A harvest so generous the stew pot would never run empty. On quiet evenings, perhaps a shy boy from the neighboring village. A life built from kindness rather than ambition. Her world was made of simple, beautiful things. Sunlight warming her face in summer. Bread rising in her mother's oven. Her brother's laughter echoing through the yard. She was a good daughter. A good sister. A good soul. A normal girl in a normal world. And far above her, on a hill that pierced the clouds, a predator searched for new flesh. Ella did not know. She could not know. The monster had not yet descended. The day it came began like any other. A visitor arrived. Strangers were rare in places like this. Roads passed them by. News traveled slowly. But this woman was unmistakably out of place. She was clean. Her clothes were well made. Her posture composed. Her voice carried authority. The confidence of someone who had never counted coins before buying bread. This was Judith Majora. She did not arrive like a threat. She arrived like hope. She gathered the villagers together and spoke with practiced warmth. She told them the great Countess Báthory sought capable young women to serve in her magnificent household. She painted a vision too bright to doubt. Warm rooms. Regular meals. Proper clothing. And wages. Money that could be sent home. Money that could mend roofs. Buy medicine. Keep families alive through winter. To the villagers, this was not employment. It was deliverance. A miracle wrapped in polite words. Ella's parents listened, torn apart by conflicting emotions. Hope battled fear. Love warred with instinct. They looked at their daughter. Strong. Young. Full of promise. Then at their own calloused hands and collapsing walls. They wanted more for her. Something better than survival. How could they deny her this chance? How could they cage her in poverty when a door to another life had appeared? And so, with trembling voices and tearful eyes, they agreed. Ella was radiant with joy. She hugged her parents tightly. Promised to work hard. To send money home. To make them proud. She believed she was stepping into a fairy tale. She did not see the shadow cast by the castle on the hill. She did not hear the hunger waiting behind stone walls. And as she prepared to leave her village behind, the door to her old life closed quietly behind her. A pale morning sun hangs low over the village as Ella takes her final steps away from home. She promised her parents she would make them proud. She swore she would send money, that their sacrifices would not be in vain. She hugged her little brother tightly, brushed dirt from his hair, and told him to behave while she was gone. She packed what little she owned, and with hope bright in her eyes she followed the well-dressed woman up the road. Ella looked back only once. Then she looked forward. To the castle. It rose from the hill like something unreal. A palace torn from a dream and nailed to the sky. From a distance, it looked magnificent. Safe. Powerful. She believed she was walking toward her future. She did not know she was walking toward her grave. The journey was the most thrilling experience of her young life. With every step, the fortress grew larger, more overwhelming, until it swallowed the horizon. Its towers clawed at the clouds. Banners bearing the Countess's sigil snapped violently in the wind. Awe filled her chest. So did fear. She, a village girl, was going to live here. At the gate, the housekeeper led her forward. The doors were colossal, thick wood reinforced with iron. As they opened, the hinges screamed. A sound old, an animal. As if the castle itself were protesting. They stepped inside. The gates slammed shut behind them. The sound was deep. Final. It echoed through the courtyard and into Ella's bones. You are inside now. You do not leave. Fear bloomed. Sharp. Undeniable. Ella turned toward the woman who had spoken so kindly in her village. The smile was gone. The warmth was gone. The face staring back at her was cold. Empty. Predatory. A hand clamped down on Ella's arm. Too tight. She was dragged forward. Not toward kitchens filled with warmth and noise. Not toward servants laughing over shared labor. She was taken down a narrow corridor where sound died quickly. The air grew colder. The light dimmer. Stone stairs spiraled downward. Each step carried her further from the world she knew. Her heart hammered violently against her ribs. This was wrong. This was not opportunity. This was a trap. The housekeeper stopped before a thick wooden door, blackened with age, set deep within a forgotten part of the castle. This was not a bedroom. This was a cell. As the iron key turned in the lock, Ella understood. She was not here to serve. She was here to be taken. She was the harvest. What followed, what happened to Ella and to the dozens, perhaps hundreds of girls who followed her through those gates, is the darkest chapter of this story. The details come from survivor testimonies, from court records, from chilling confessions. This was not madness unleashed. It was procedure. Routine. Elizabeth no longer saw people. She saw variables. In her twisted logic, she was an experimenter. The dungeon was her laboratory. Pain was applied with purpose. Fear was measured. Blood was collected methodically. She observed with detached fascination. Which methods broke the spirit fastest? Which produced the most blood? Which prolonged suffering without killing? Every scream became information. Every wound became data. One of her preferred methods turned the land itself into a weapon. The Hungarian winter. Girls were dragged outside. Stripped naked. Doused with freezing water. Elizabeth watched as the cold seized their bodies. As ice formed on their skin. As breath turned shallow and frantic. She observed. She learned. She refined. This was no longer about beauty alone. It was about control over life itself. And the castle on the hill, once a symbol of power, had become something else entirely. A slaughterhouse. A place where innocence climbed the road full of hope. And never returned. Night smothers the castle. Snow drifts silently into the courtyard. untouched, pristine, until it is broken by dragging footsteps. A girl is hauled into the open beneath a moonless sky. Her clothes are torn away and tossed aside like scraps. She is left naked in the snow, her breath already panicked, already visible. Above her, high in a window, Elizabeth watches. She does not rush. Buckets of water are raised, then poured. Again. And again. The sound is unforgettable. The heavy slap of water striking frozen stone, echoing through the night like a drumbeat. Steam rises briefly, then vanishes as the cold claims it. The girl screams. Her skin darkens, turns blue, then pale, then something unnatural. The water freezes on contact, sealing her inside a growing shell of ice. Movement slows. Trembling becomes shuddering. Elizabeth waits, patient, until the girl stands motionless. A living statue. A monument to winter's merciless power. Another night. Another experiment. Fire. Iron tongs, once used to feed hearths, are left buried in flame until their tips glow white-hot. In a chamber lit only by candles, Elizabeth observes closely as metal meets flesh. She studies reaction. She listens. Sometimes she prefers something smaller, more intimate. A candle tilted just enough. Hot wax spilling slowly onto skin. The scent of melting wax blending with fear. With burned flesh. With silence that comes too late. Then there is hunger. Not the quick brutality of pain, but its slower cousin. Girls are sealed into darkness. Given nothing. No food. No light. Days pass. Weeks. Their bodies weaken while their minds fracture. They hear the castle alive beyond their door. Smell bread baking. Hear laughter. Hope rises. Then collapses. Starvation becomes a weapon. And sometimes, something inside Elizabeth snaps. Discipline vanishes. The wolf blood takes over. Witnesses later claimed she attacked like an animal, tearing flesh with her teeth, biting arms, shoulders, faces. No ritual, no method, only rage. But one story eclipsed them all. The legend that would turn Elizabeth into something immortal. The Iron Maiden. The tale speaks of a tall metal figure shaped like a woman. Beautiful from the outside. Elegant. Inside, it hid dozens of silver spikes, each carefully placed to avoid the heart. A girl would be forced inside. The doors would close. Slowly. As metal pierced skin, blood flowed downward. Collected in a basin below. Ready for the Countess's use. Most historians now doubt this device ever existed. But legends are born for a reason. The truth was so horrific, so calculated, so inventive that reality alone could not contain it. People needed a symbol equal to the cruelty they sensed. A queen-shaped monster. And yet, a crucial question remains. Was this really about blood? Was all this suffering simply a means to preserve youth? The confessions of her accomplices reveal a colder truth. The rituals did not work. The mirror never softened. Each morning, it still showed the same lines. The same slow erosion. Time remained undefeated. For Elizabeth, who had never truly failed, this was unbearable. So the goal shifted. The outcome no longer mattered. The process did. Planning. Anticipation. Execution. Control. Pain became performance. Ritual replaced cure. Cruelty filled the vast, aching emptiness of her days. In those locked rooms, Elizabeth Báthory discovered something her power outside could never give her. Total dominion. She was no longer merely a countess. She was judge. She was executioner. She was fate. She decided who screamed, who begged, who went silent. She decided who lived, and who vanished. From her window, wrapped in fur and certainty, the woman on the hill ruled her private universe. A god of suffering. Silence. Not the peaceful kind. The heavy stillness that follows screaming. For Elizabeth, this was the apex. The feeling that erased everything else. The mirror no longer mattered. The creeping lines faded from her thoughts. Even death, her own inevitable end, lost its grip. Inside those locked rooms, fear dissolved into something intoxicating. The girls were no longer experiments. They were objects. Dolls in a private theater of suffering. Pieces to be bent, broken, rearranged at will. This was the birth of true sadism. The illusion of rejuvenation no longer mattered. Blood was no longer medicine. Pain itself became the reward. Control became pleasure. Cruelty ceased to be a path towards something else. Cruelty was the destination. Elizabeth was no longer a woman grasping for youth. She had become a hunter. And she was savoring the chase. From this obsession emerged the most infamous image attached to her name. The vision that would stalk the human imagination for centuries. The Blood Countess. The bath. Picture a chamber buried deep beneath the castle. Unseen by daylight. A private bathing room carved from dark stone. Steam hangs thick in the air, scented with rare oils and heavy perfumes. Sweet enough to mask something sharper. Something metallic that never quite leaves. At the center lies a sunken pool of white marble. Flawless in its craftsmanship. Tonight, it is not filled with water. The marble is stained red. The pool brims with freshly spilled blood. Elizabeth enters. Her attendants follow silently. Their faces flicker in candlelight like spirits at a forbidden rite. No one speaks. This is ceremony. Her robes slip from her shoulders and fall soundlessly to the floor. In this room, she is no longer a noblewoman. She is something else. She steps into the pool. The unnatural warmth coats her skin. She closes her eyes. Tilts her head back. She feels no guilt. No horror. Only peace. In her mind, this is not death. It is vitality. Not murder. Renewal. A fountain that restores what time steals. She believes with complete devotion that each moment submerged brings her closer to eternity. That the blood erases decay. That she is washing mortality from her flesh. It is a perfect image. And almost certainly a lie. The blood bath never appears in the trial records. Not once. Hundreds of pages of testimony catalogue her crimes in excruciating detail. Yet this ritual is absent. Her servants confess to countless horrors. But not this. The legend emerged later. A myth blooming from the soil of real atrocity. And yet it endures. Because it captures something true. She may not have bathed in blood. But she wanted to. She longed to cloak herself in stolen youth. To wrap herself in life taken from others. To shield herself from the truth reflected in her mirror. The blood bath is not history. It is symbolism. A nightmare that reveals the shape of her desire. Inside the castle, Elizabeth lived within her dark fantasy. But beyond those walls, reality was catching up. Because one missing girl is tragedy. Two raise questions. And when they do not return, the world begins to notice. Mist rolls through the valley at dawn. One girl disappears. That is tragedy. Two can still be dismissed. But when the count rises 3, 4, 10, 20, it stops being chance. It becomes pattern. A hunt. At first, fear moved quietly. A whisper shared between mothers at wells. A glance held too long at an empty bed. A name spoken only behind closed doors. Then the fear spread. Like disease. Life in the villages changed. Daughters were never sent alone. Roads once walked freely were avoided. A knock from a finely dressed stranger no longer brought hope. It brought dread. The castle on the hill transformed in the minds of the people. What was once protection became a curse. A looming shadow that devoured the young. No one dared speak the Countess's name aloud. To accuse her was to summon her attention. And that was a fate worse than silence. So they gave her another name. The Ogre of Cactus. The whispers grew louder. They reached places they were never meant to reach. A Lutheran minister named Istvan Magyari began to hear the stories. Mothers came to him in tears. Fathers spoke with voices broken by guilt and helpless rage. He offered prayer. But he understood this was not divine punishment. It was human evil. Officials noticed something else. Records changed. Names disappeared. Too many. Too often. Empty chairs appeared at dinner tables across the region. This was no longer just peasant grief. It was becoming an open secret. Still, what could be done? The woman on the hill was not merely wealthy. She was Báthory. Her bloodline intertwined with kings and princes. Her influence stretched far beyond her lands. To accuse her openly was not dangerous. It was unthinkable. Who challenges an ogre when the ogre wears a crown? For years, she remained untouched. As long as the missing were the daughters of the poor, their absence barely registered beyond the valley. Their suffering was invisible to the world that mattered. But Elizabeth was changing. The mirror continued its quiet cruelty. And in her mind, arrogance twisted failure into explanation. The blood of peasants, she decided, was flawed. Too coarse. Tainted by labor, hunger, and dirt. It lacked refinement. She needed blood like her own. Noble blood. Pure. This realization marked a terrifying escalation. How could she reach the daughters of aristocracy? She could not recruit them as servants. So she invented something far more elegant. An invitation. Official letters went out across the region to minor noble families. Houses with proud names and dwindling fortunes. Families desperate to maintain status. The Countess Báthory announced the opening of a special academy. A school. Inside her own castle. We must understand what this meant. In the 16th century, a young noblewoman's future hinged on marriage. Education was rare. Opportunity rarer still. To be instructed by the Countess herself, niece to a king and ruler of vast lands, was unimaginable prestige. A daughter trained under her guidance would become the most desirable bride in the kingdom. Elizabeth promised refinement. Languages. Etiquette. Music. Courtly behavior. Everything required to secure an advantageous marriage. To these families, the offer was not suspicious. It was salvation. And so, once again, girls packed their belongings. Parents said goodbye. The road to the castle filled with hopeful footsteps. They did not know the rules had changed. The hunt had evolved. And the ogre on the hill had learned to wear silk. Ink dries slowly on parchment. The promise was intoxicating. Elizabeth offered more than education. She offered transformation. She spoke of posture. Of dance. Of language refined enough for princes and dukes. Of how to speak without lowering one's eyes. Of how to survive, and thrive, at the royal court. She was not training servants. She was shaping queens. For struggling noble families, this was irresistible. They lived far from the villages under the castle's shadow. They did not hear the peasants' whispers. And even if they had, they would have dismissed them. The suffering of the poor belonged to another world. All they saw was the Báthory name, and a future polished in gold. The letters went out. The replies came back. Grateful. Eager. Unquestioning. The trap closed softly. One day, a fine carriage drawn by 4 black horses climbed the winding road to Čachtice Castle. It stopped beneath the looming gate. A servant opened the door. A young noblewoman stepped down. Her clothes were elegant. Her posture proud. Her eyes bright with anticipation. She did not know she was the first. The first of a new harvest. For years the dragon had fed on sheep. Now, it turned its hunger toward wolves. And that was a mistake even Elizabeth could not afford. The academy was a brilliant deception. But it carried a fatal flaw. Peasant girls vanished quietly. Their families had no recourse. No connections. No voice beyond their grief. But noble daughters belonged to a network. They had fathers who expected letters. Mothers who counted days. Uncles who served at court. Cousins who commanded soldiers. They were not invisible. At first, silence was excused. Weeks passed without word. Fathers told themselves their daughters were busy with studies. That winter roads delayed messengers. Polite inquiries were sent to the castle. Polite replies returned. She is unwell but recovering. She is on retreat. She cannot be disturbed. The explanations were flawless. Until 2 men met. Perhaps old comrades. At a wedding. A council gathering. They spoke of families. Of daughters. One mentioned his child studying under the great countess. The other went still. Mine too. They spoke of the same silence. The same excuses. The same illness. The same retreat. At the same time. Trust curdled into fear. This was no accident. No coincidence. The tone changed. Polite letters became demands. Demands became accusations. These were not peasant whispers. They were formal complaints. Sealed with noble wax. Written on expensive paper. They traveled swiftly. To Vienna. To Buda. Onto desks where decisions shaped kingdoms. For the first time, the name Báthory echoed through halls of power. Not with admiration, but with suspicion. The king could no longer ignore it. The ogre on the hill had become a political crisis. The net began to tighten. The king of Hungary faced an impossible problem. He could not simply send soldiers. To do so would risk civil fracture. The woman accused was too powerful. Too connected. To hunt something like this, you needed a hunter of equal weight. The king knew exactly who that was. His name was György Thurzó, Palatine of Hungary. The second highest authority in the realm. Judge. General. The king's voice made flesh. One of the few men whose power could rival Elizabeth's own. And fate, with its cruel sense of irony, had chosen well. Thurzó was her cousin. He knew the family. He knew the pride. He knew the legends whispered behind closed doors. And he knew that if even half of what was being said was true, then the monster on the hill was real. And it was time to open the gates. A door closes softly in a royal palace. The king of Hungary leaned close and spoke in confidence. His command was not written. It was not announced. It was secret. Go to the lands of the Countess Báthory. Discover whether the rumors are true. And if they are, end it. By any means necessary. With that order, everything changed. This was no longer a matter of grief or rumor. No priest's plea. No father's despair. This was the state itself moving. Quietly. Deliberately. And the man chosen to act was not one easily deceived. Georgi Thurzo was methodical, loyal, unimpressed by titles or wealth. He did not rush. He did not boast. He hunted patiently. And for the first time in her life, Elizabeth Báthory had a real enemy. Not a servant. Not a peasant. Not a frightened village. A man with authority equal to her own. A man empowered to tear down stone walls and drag secrets into daylight. And she had no idea he was coming. Thurzo understood the danger. An accusation against the Báthory had to be flawless. Any weakness would be torn apart by politics and bloodline. So he did not confront her. He listened. His most trusted men entered her lands disguised as travelers. No banners. No commands. They spoke softly, promised protection, and waited. At first, there was silence. Then, after years of terror, the stories came pouring out. Names, dates, details spoken through tears. Everything was recorded. One testimony came from a minor nobleman. His voice was hollow with guilt. She promised to make my daughter a lady. I gave her coins for the journey. I watched the carriage disappear down the road. I never saw her again. Another came from a girl who had escaped. She rolled back her sleeves. White scars crossed her arms and hands like pale spiderwebs. It was a game to her, she said. She would prick us with needles just to see if we cried. We learned to stay silent. A priest told a different kind of horror. He spoke of nights when two familiar servants, Fixco and Ilona, passed through the graveyard after midnight. They carried heavy baskets. They dug in unconsecrated ground. I did not know what they buried, he said. They were too small to be grown people. I was too afraid to ask. Thurzo read every word. A pattern emerged. The promise was always opportunity. The cruelty was always personal. And the end was always silence. Always an unmarked grave. The list of missing girls grew longer. And longer. Each testimony was a stone. Thurzo gathered them patiently, methodically. Until the pile became a mountain. Too heavy to ignore. Too solid to deny. He now held the voices of the living, the shadows of the dead, and the authority of the crown. It was enough. The time had come to enter the dragon's lair. While Thurzo's men moved quietly through villages, another poison spread inside the castle walls. Fear. Elizabeth, who had lived her entire life believing herself untouchable, began to feel watched. Her brilliant mind turned inward. Then inward again. Tightening into paranoia. Two maids whispering became traitors. A pause in conversation became conspiracy. Punishments multiplied. Not for crimes, but for imagined disloyalty. The castle that had once been her kingdom now felt like a cage. Its walls pressed closer each night. She paced the corridors after dark. Listened at doors. Convinced that everyone was plotting her destruction. Servants. Helpers. Even those she had raised from nothing. Her inner circle felt it too. They had believed her power would shield them forever. Now they understood the truth. Power attracts attention. And attention brings judgment. Somewhere beyond the forests, beyond the villages, a hunter was preparing to strike. And the monster on the hill was beginning to sense it. Fear fractures loyalty. They had never been her equals. They had been tools. And tools are always the first to be discarded. As the hunters drew closer, the fragile unity of Elizabeth's inner circle collapsed. What had once been bound together by secrecy and blood now rotted from the inside with terror. Dorothea no longer whispered promises of youth. Her chamber filled with choking smoke as she burned foul-smelling herbs, frantically leafing through ancient pages. She was no longer searching for beauty. She was searching for protection. For a spell to erase them. To blind the law. To make consequences disappear. Ilona unraveled. Her hands shook constantly. One evening, as she poured wine, a few dark drops spilled across the table. Elizabeth did not raise her voice. She simply stopped. And stared. Long. Silent. In that silence, Ilona felt something worse than punishment. She felt herself already condemned. Even Fixco felt it. He sharpened blades for hours, again and again, until metal screamed against stone. His simple mind understood only one response to danger. Violence. They whispered in corners. In kitchens after midnight. In shadows where firelight could not reach. We should run, Fixco muttered. And go where? Dorothea hissed. Without her name, we are nothing but criminals. This must stop, Ilona sobbed. We've gone too far. We must beg her mercy. But mercy no longer existed in the castle. Elizabeth heard them. One night, she confronted Fixco alone. Her voice was low. Intimate. Lethal. Do not think you can escape me. There is nowhere on this earth my family cannot reach. She leaned closer. Our fates are bound. You are loyal to me. Or you are nothing. The coven shattered. Trust dissolved into suspicion. Fear turned inward. They watched each other more closely than the world outside. And in doing so, they missed the sound of the hunter arriving. The end came just after Christmas. Winter gripped the land in iron silence. The investigation was complete. The evidence undeniable. The king's authority absolute. On a frozen night in 1610, Thurzo arrived at Čachtice Castle with 300 armed soldiers. No disguises. No politeness. No knocking. The gates were smashed open by force. Wood splintered. Iron screamed. Soldiers flooded the castle like a black tide. Servants froze where they stood. No one resisted. No one dared. Thurzo moved directly downward. Down stone staircases slick with damp. Into air that stank of rot and iron. And there, the rumors became flesh. Cells hidden behind false walls. Girls chained in darkness. Skeletal. Barely alive. Eyes burned hollow by terror so deep it had consumed tears long ago. Instruments still wet with blood. And in one cold chamber, a body. Pale. Recent. Waiting. The accomplices were seized quickly. Dorothea was dragged out screaming curses. Ilona was found collapsed in sobs. Fixco fought. For soldiers pinned him to the ground with ease. With survivors tended and the dungeons secured, Thurzo knew the final confrontation awaited. He ascended alone. Each step echoed through the now silent castle. At the top, in the great dining hall, warmth returned. A fire roared. At the head of a long, empty table sat Elizabeth Báthory. She wore black velvet. Her posture was perfect. Her eyes were cold with outrage. Not fear. She was offended. Thurzo did not present evidence. He did not need to. The proof was screaming below them. He spoke only once. Calmly. Formally. He told her he acted under royal authority. And that her reign at Čachtice was over. His men waited. They expected chains. A public arrest. But Thurzo understood the danger. She was a monster. And she was also Báthory. A public trial would tear the kingdom apart. And so he made a decision. One that stunned even his own soldiers. The fire crackles. Chains clink softly. Silence presses in. Thurzo did not raise his hand to order her seized. He looked upon the most prolific killer the kingdom had ever known and pronounced a sentence that stunned the room. House arrest. Elizabeth Báthory would never leave her castle again. No chains. No public humiliation. No scaffold. The monster was exposed. Her servants were in irons. Her secrets lay bleeding in the open. But the dragon itself was too powerful to be paraded like a common criminal. And so the world was forced to confront a terrifying question. How do you punish a killer who cannot be touched? And worse, what happens when a creature of immense rage is cornered with nothing left to lose? The trial began in the winter of 1611. The great hall filled with judges, nobles, and officials. The air was thick with dread, heavy with the knowledge that unspeakable truths were about to be spoken aloud. And yet, everyone noticed the same thing. The most important seat was empty. Elizabeth Báthory was not on trial. Her name, her blood, still shielded her from public judgment. Instead, the court judged her extensions. Her hands. Her teeth. Her shadow. Ilona Jo. Dorothea. Fixco. They stood before the court no longer powerful, no longer feared. Their faces were pale. Their bodies thin. Their eyes hollow with certainty. They knew they would not leave alive. And to save themselves they spoke. One by one. Ilona collapsed into tears. She said she loved Elizabeth. That she had raised her. That she was terrified to refuse her orders. She believed she would be killed if she disobeyed. Dorothea protested in a rasping voice. She claimed she spoke only of old remedies. Simple folk knowledge. She said it was the Countess who demanded blood. That the others enjoyed the cruelty. Fixco stared at the floor. He said he was only a servant. That he followed orders. That he did not plan anything. He said he was not clever enough. They blamed each other. They minimized. They begged. But every confession told the same story. They named the girls. They described their faces. They spoke of needles. Of beatings. Of freezing water. Of fire. Of starvation. They revealed a castle transformed into a machine built solely for suffering. Every word flew like an arrow. And every arrow pointed toward the silent fortress on the hill. Toward the same name. Elizabeth Báthory. The judges had heard enough. The verdict came swiftly. Justice in the 17th century was not merciful. It was theatrical. Pain was part of the sentence. Fear was the lesson. Dorothea and Ilona were condemned first. Their fingers, the same fingers that had held torches and instruments, were torn from their hands with heated pincers. Their screams echoed through the square. Then they were bound to wooden stakes. And burned alive. Their bodies were reduced to ash. Their secrets carried away by the winter wind. Fixco's sentence was shorter. He was led to the block. One swing. His head struck the ground. A few days later, the sentences were carried out before a vast crowd. People gathered not for celebration, but for closure. They watched the tools of the Blood Countess break. The hands that carried out her will were destroyed. The coven of cruelty was gone. But as smoke rose into the grey sky, a single thought lingered in every mind. The servants were dead. But the master lived. Where was justice for her? The question hung unanswered in the frozen air. And the answer, when it came, would leave many deeply unsatisfied. There would be no trial. No courtroom. No moment where Elizabeth Báthory stood before the people to answer for what she had done. And to understand why, we must understand who she was. She was not merely a murderer. She was Báthory, niece of a king, blood bound to the most powerful noble houses in the kingdom. Her family was woven into the structure of power itself. To drag her into open court would not simply expose one woman. It would expose an entire ruling class. Her crimes were not only horrific. They were embarrassing. A public trial would have torn away the illusion of noble virtue. It would have shown the people that their rulers were capable of unimaginable cruelty. It would have weakened Hungary at home and humiliated it abroad. So the decision was made. Quietly. The monster and the story would be buried. There would be no public confession. No final judgment spoken aloud. No moment of closure for the families who had lost their daughters. They would never look her in the eye. Never hear her name read alongside her crimes. She was too powerful to be treated like a common criminal. Too shameful to be spoken of openly. But she would not walk free. Georgi Thurzo designed a different ending. Not a swift death. Not martyrdom. Something slower. Something colder. Something meant to erase. A public execution would have turned Elizabeth into legend in a single blaze of fire. It would have given her spectacle. Meaning. Finality. That was not justice. So Thurzo chose a punishment aimed not at her body, but at her mind. They did not send an executioner. They sent bricklayers. By royal order, Elizabeth Báthory was imprisoned inside her own castle. Sealed within a small suite of rooms high in the Tower of Cactus. The symbol of her power became her tomb. She likely stood in rigid silence as the work began. Too proud to beg. Too furious to scream. She listened. To the scrape of trowels. The wet slap of mortar. The dull thud of brick after brick. The sound of a world shrinking. First, the windows were sealed. She would have watched her lands disappear. Forests. Roads. Villages she once ruled. Each view swallowed by stone. Light dimmed. Shadows deepened. Then came darkness. They moved to the doors next. With every layer of brick, the sounds of life faded. Footsteps. Voices. The living castle she once commanded fell silent. When the final brick was set, there was no handle. No key. No lock. Only a wall. A single small opening remained. Just large enough for bread and water to be pushed through. Elizabeth Báthory became a ghost in her own home. It was perfect. The woman obsessed with her reflection, who feared the smallest wrinkle, was condemned to total darkness. She would never see her face again. The mirror that had ruled her thoughts became useless glass in a black room. The woman who had played God, who decided who lived and who died, was reduced to absolute dependence. Her survival rested on the anonymous hand of a guard sliding food through a hole. She, who commanded thousands, could not command a single candle to be lit. She, whose name had shaken kingdoms, was no longer spoken at all. Báthory became a forbidden word. And somewhere high in a sealed tower, the woman who believed herself eternal sat alone. Unseen. Unheard. Erased. She was alive. But to the world beyond the castle walls, Elizabeth Báthory had vanished. The woman who once drifted through candlelit halls in silk and velvet, who slept on feather beds and commanded servants with a word, now lay on bare stone. Wrapped in rags. Breathing stale air. Confined to a space no larger than a grave. And perhaps this was the truest justice of all. The woman who had filled her castle with screams was condemned to silence. No voices to command. No victims to break. No conspirators to whisper with. Only darkness. Only memory. Only herself. A swift execution would have been release. This was not release. This was a cage crafted precisely for the creature it held. She had been erased. Days bled into nights. Nights into years. For nearly 4 years, Elizabeth Báthory existed inside that stone coffin. She never saw the sun rise or fall. Spring and summer passed unnoticed. Seasons meant nothing. Her world was black. Silent. Broken only once a day by the scraping sound of a plate pushed through a narrow opening in the wall. And this leaves us with the final, unanswerable question. What happens to a mind like hers when it is left alone in the dark? Did regret ever surface? Did the silence finally echo with the screams she had caused? Did faces appear, hundreds of them, staring back at her from the black? Or did her pride remain unbroken? Did she spend her final years not in sorrow, but in rage? Rage at her victims for being weak. At her servants for betraying her. At Thurzo and the king for daring to challenge her. Did she die believing she had done nothing wrong? No one knows. Her final thoughts are the last secret she carried to the grave. In the late summer of 1614, a guard came to deliver her meal. He slid the plate through the opening. There was no sound. He called out. No answer. After waiting, he summoned the captain. A decision was made. The wall would be opened. The same masons who had sealed her in were called back. Hammer and chisel struck stone. Mortar cracked. And for the first time in years, light spilled into the tomb. They found her on the floor. Cold. Still. The great Countess Elizabeth Báthory, the ogre of Cactus, the Blood Countess of legend, had died exactly as she had lived her final years. Alone. The walls of Čachtice Castle keep their secrets. Official records describe a sadistic killer who used absolute power to commit unthinkable crimes. Yet whispers of conspiracy never fully disappeared. Some claim she was framed by rivals and relatives eager to claim her fortune. Others believe the truth was so horrifying it had to be transformed into myth. Over centuries, documented torture blurred into bloodbaths. Cruelty became vampirism. History fused with nightmare, forever binding her name to the shadow of Dracula. Elizabeth Báthory's story forces us to confront something deeply unsettling. The nature of unchecked power, the fragility of truth, and the thin line where history ends and legend begins. What do you believe happened inside that castle? Was she history's most savage female killer? Or its most demonized woman? Tell us your theory in the comments. And if you're drawn to the darkest corners of forgotten history, like this video, subscribe, and ring the bell so you don't miss what waits in the shadows next. Thank you for watching.